In this part of the lecture, we're going to discuss the Progressive Era presidents. Now, what's happening during the Progressive Era is happening while these presidents are in office. So, despite the fact that we've talked about all of these reforms, it's not like the presidents weren't yet in office. I'm just going to focus here on specifically what the presidents did that makes them noteworthy. So, Teddy Roosevelt had come in after McKinley had died, was shot. So, Teddy Roosevelt came in and actually only served 6 years, and he will later try to run for another 4 years, but not actually when his first elected term is up. I know that's a little bit confusing, but Teddy Roosevelt saw himself as a progressive and called his deal or his approach, his philosophy, the square deal. And it had three C's. It had fighting corporations, which is going to be your quote unquote trust busting. It had your conservation, which is going to be protecting the environment, but it's not preservation. And then you're going to have your consumer protection, how to watch out for the people that are consuming the products. So first we'll look at corporations. Teddy Roosevelt fancied himself a trust buster, yet he didn't bust all trusts, as we saw in our progressive debate. He had a difference between, in his mind, good trusts, those monopolies that actually were able to, because of their size, deliver better products and drive prices down, and those bad trusts where he thought were actually exploiting both workers and consumers. Now, famously, he did bust one big trust called the Northern Securities, which was a J.P. Morgan company, and in doing so, he sort of proved his mettle as a trust buster. The Supreme Court backed him up, and whenever he was sort of called out and saying, well, you're not really busting all trusts, he say, look, I went after Northern Securities. Now, famously, Teddy Roosevelt was an outdoorsman. He was a hunter. He loved nature. But he didn't want to necessarily keep nature completely pristine as it was. He wanted to keep it away from developers and business, but he wanted people to be able to use it. So his idea, which was backed up by his right-hand man, his forestry guy, Gifford Pinchot, who we heard from in the Hetch Hetchy debate, they both believed in this idea of pan-utilization or multiple-use resource management, which of course was exemplified in what they thought should be done with Hetch Hetchy. Should dam it so that you can actually create a big water source not only for San Francisco, but also so you could fish and you could swim and you could boat in there. Now again, John Muir said, no, you can't touch it at all. You should leave it with Mother Nature as she originally ordained it. So a conservationist, but not a preservationist. And then this consumer protection. So again, we saw it earlier with ideas like the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. But we're going to see it really in terms of protecting consumers when it came to the 1902 coal strike. Now, this was a major strike in the coal mines where, since the country really ran on coal, this was really hurting the consumers as they went into winter. And so the fact that Teddy Roosevelt called the miners union, as well as the mine operators, the owners, to the White House and says, you better solve this, or I'm actually going to bring the military in to run this coal mine, was a big historic move. Because as we saw throughout the Gilded Age, it seemed like the presidents and the governors, and even the mayors, seemed to always come down on the side of the owners, much at the expense of the workers. Now, Teddy really tried to come in as a neutral arbiter of all of this, and in the end, both sides sort of got what they wanted, and Teddy looked like he actually was helping the little guy, the consumers. After 6 years, Teddy Roosevelt decided not to run again, although he could have. So he basically handpicked his successor, who was William Howard Taft, much the same way that Andrew Jackson had picked Martin Van Buren way back in 1836. Now, the expectation is that Taft would be a true progressive, just like Teddy thought he was. Now, in the end, William Howard Taft actually did more progressively than Roosevelt did. Specifically, he conserved more land, and he busted more trusts than the alleged trust buster. But the question is, how is it that the hand-picked successor ultimately became the adversary? Because 4 years later, Teddy Roosevelt will run again against Taft. So we need to figure out what happened there in their relationship. One of the arguments is that Taft didn't do what Teddy liked. Now, you got to look at three main events. The first one's called the Payne-Aldrich Tariff. Progressives were not a fan of high tariffs, again, as tariffs protect industry, and again, progressives were fighting for the little guy, and so they wanted a lower tariff. Well, at the end of the day, even though Taft said he wanted a lower tariff, once the more conservative Republicans had gone to work on this particular tariff, it actually increased rates, yet Taft signed it anyway. So it was seen as a sign of betrayal for the progressive cause. The next is something called the Ballinger-Pinchot controversy. It's sort of odd to think about, but the main idea is that under Taft, there was a Secretary of the Interior. That's all the federal lands. And a guy named Richard Ballinger had attempted to basically allow for private development of about 1 million acres of forest and mineral reserves that Teddy, during his presidency, had said, no, you can't touch. Now, Gifford Pinchot, who was Teddy's right-hand man when it came to forestry, went to Taft and said, hey, you can't do that. Teddy had set this land aside. Taft said, nah, you know what, I'm not going to do anything about it. Pinchot got pissed. He went to the media and he went to Congress and said, do something about it. And then Pinchot gets fired. So you're like, what's the big deal? Well, since this is Teddy's ally and he was fired by Taft, Teddy took it as a personal offense. And last but not least, there was a monopoly, one of those good trusts that Teddy had signed off on, which is where U.S. Steel had acquired some other companies. Remember, U.S. Steel was that whole company bought by J.P. Morgan from Andrew Carnegie to be the first billion-dollar corporation. Well, Teddy said, yeah, this is fine. This is not a bad trust. Well, under Taft, it was ruled a bad trust, and it was actually, a case was brought against them. So at the end of the day, between what you have the higher tariff, then you have firing his friend, and then going after a trust that he said was good, Teddy's pissed, and Teddy wants back in the game. He sort of unofficially throws his hat back in the ring at a famous speech at Osawatomie, Kansas, the whole new nationalism speech that you actually read for the mini debate. The main idea is that Teddy sort of admits, hey, you know what, maybe I wasn't a real progressive the first time around, but I'm a real progressive now. So vote for me if you want a true progressive in the White House for the Republican Party. But the problem was that Taft was already supposedly a progressive in the White House as a Republican. So Teddy and Taft are going to battle it out. And when they go to the convention in Chicago, Teddy actually loses. He thinks he should win. He's Teddy Roosevelt. But Taft's in office and Taft's able to sort of swing it his way. So Teddy gets pissed and Teddy basically forms his own party, the Progressive Party, that he calls colloquially the Bull Moose Party, because he was quote-unquote as fit as a bull moose, despite the fact that he had been shot on the campaign trail. So now what you're going to have in this running are the sort of normal parties, Taft as the Republican, the incumbent president, Woodrow Wilson as the Democrat, Teddy as a Progressive Party candidate, and then you're going to have Eugene V. Debs, a socialist, all of whom are generally pretty progressive candidates relative to what we've seen throughout history. Now, what we're going to look at when we get to that election of 1912 is that in some ways, sort of the Republicans, Taft and Teddy, cancel each other out and allow Woodrow Wilson to come into office. And the big difference between Teddy Roosevelt's new nationalism and Woodrow Wilson's new freedom, which we discussed during the mini debate, is around trusts. Now, Woodrow Wilson says, get rid of them all. The idea of new freedom is that trusts inhibit people's freedom to make money and rise up. So he said, we want to have complete elimination of trusts. And at the same time, he pretty much is saying, we don't want government interference in people's social lives. So it's interesting. We want total government regulation. Sorry, not regulation. We want total government elimination of trusts. So strong government in that regard. But generally speaking, we're not going to go all in on social programs, which may sound not all that progressive, but then again, he was from the South. Now, on the flip side, you have Teddy Roosevelt, who says, we want to regulate trusts. I don't think we can go all in and actually eliminate them. And on top of that, as you read in the mini debates, he said, you know what, we need to improve worker conditions. We need, fewer hours, better safety. And so he says, if we regulate, get rid of the bad ones, and we improve the conditions, then we'll be better off. But Teddy sort of doubled down even further, and he was looking for more government intervention in improving people's social lives, sort of the classic progressive idea of minimum wages, getting rid of child labor, helping in labor issues, votes for women. So Teddy really was the more progressive, quote-unquote, of the two, despite the fact that he wasn't going to completely eliminate trusts. Now, Wilson is elected in 1912. He will be the president from 1912 to 1920, all the way throughout World War I. And we want to think about, what did Wilson do? Because Wilson does get a ton of credit for being a progressive. Now, Wilson went after what he called sort of the triple wall of privilege. And so the first thing he's going to do is he's actually going to sign a tariff cut. Again, the whole idea that tariffs help big business, they hurt the little guy, they hurt the little companies. And so you have something called the Underwood-Simmons tariff. Again, the name is not important, but what is important is as a condition of this tariff, it allowed for what's called a graduated income tax, which means that the wealthy pay more in taxes than those who are poor. That's actually the 16th Amendment that allowed for that. The 16th Amendment allowed for an income tax, 17th Amendment, direct election of senators, 18, prohibition of alcohol, and 19, women's suffrage. In addition, Wilson is going to create something that we now know as the Fed, or the Federal Reserve Bank. The important part that you want to know is it's sort of a second or third or fourth coming of the Bank of the United States. There are going to be regional banks around the country as well as sort of one Fed. And the whole idea here is that you can shift money around to different parts of the country, particularly to avoid panics like we saw in 1819, 37, 57, 73, and 93, to make it so that the country can be more financially stable. Then we've got the Clayton Antitrust Act, which is known as the Magna Carta of Labor. Well, and we're going to actually have a second Magna Carta, so just wait till the New Deal. But the idea here was that you finally needed an antitrust act that was actually an antitrust act, whereas the Sherman Antitrust Act, which had been passed in 1890, didn't actually do anything to bust trusts and actually went against labor unions. This is going to attempt to bust trusts, and it does somewhat. But more importantly, it finally says once and for all, labor unions are not illegal. And when people strike, it's not illegal. So it very much went against the whole idea that had been used in the Sherman Antitrust Act, particularly in the Pullman strike, and said, you know what, labor, you're okay. And labor will get a little bit stronger, but then during the 1920s, it will get much, much weaker as times are good, and then labor will get stronger in the 1930s when times are bad again.